Module 34, Inflation and Unemployment, the Phillips Curve. You have learned that expansionary policies lead to a lower unemployment rate. Next, we are going to show that there is a short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Lower unemployment tends to lead to higher inflation and vice versa. This is the concept of the Phillips curve. Phillips, looking at historical data for Britain, found that when the unemployment rate was high, the wage rate tended to fall, and when the unemployment rate was low, the wage rate tended to rise. After his study, other economists followed up studying other countries, including the U.S., and found similar results. Many economists concluded that there is a negative short-run relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, represented by the short-run Phillips curve. Since then, other observations have been made that inflation can also be influenced by external supply shocks, such as the price of oil, as well as expected inflation rates. In this module, you will learn what the Phillips curve is and the nature of the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, why there is no long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, why expansionary policies are limited in effect due to the effects of expected inflation, why even moderate levels of inflation can be hard to end, and why deflation is a problem for economic policy and leads policymakers to prefer a low but positive inflation rate. Figure 34.1 shows the unemployment and inflation rates for 1955 to 1968. Each dot shows the average U.S. unemployment rate for 1 year and the percentage increase in the Consumer Price Index over the subsequent year. This supports the theory of the short-run Phillips curve, reinforcing the negative relationship between interest rates and unemployment. In years there was a high inflation rate, there tended to be a lower unemployment rate. In years there was a low inflation rate, there tended to be a higher unemployment rate. Here we have the data from the last slide. As we connect it in a line of best fit, we can see the curve that Phillips described, and we say that this is going to be the short-run Phillips curve. When we think about the Phillips curve relative to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, we can see the same relationships shown in that model. When aggregate demand increases, then unemployment falls and the inflation rate rises. This is shown by movement along the short-run Phillips curve. The same happens if aggregate demand decreases. We have movement along this short-run curve. What about movements then in the short-run aggregate supply curve? When short-run aggregate supply decreases along the aggregate demand curve, both unemployment and inflation rates rise. This is shown as with an upward shift of the short-run Phillips curve. We know that when short-run aggregate supply increases along aggregate demand, unemployment and inflation rates fall. This is seen as a downward shift of the short-run Phillips curve. Note that the short-run Phillips curve can extend below the horizontal axis, but not beyond the vertical axis. Why do you think this would be the case? Well, we can't have negative unemployment, but we can have negative inflation. The expected rate of inflation is the rate of inflation that employers and workers expect in the near future. One of the crucial discoveries of modern macroeconomics is that changes in the expected rate of inflation affect the short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation and shift the short-run Phillips curve. Workers care about future inflation. If inflation is expected to be high in coming months, wage contracts should reflect that expectation and nominal wages will be increased. In fact, Both workers and employers will factor expected inflation into all wage and price contracts because no one wants to lose purchasing power due to future inflation. For these reasons, an increase in expected inflation shifts the short-run Phillips curve upward. The actual rate of inflation at any given unemployment rate is higher when the expected inflation rate is higher. In fact, macroeconomists believe that the relationship between changes in expected inflation and changes in actual inflation is 1-to-1. That is, when expected inflation rate increases, the actual inflation rate will increase by the same amount. Why? Suppose inflation has been near zero for years, but gradually people begin to expect inflation of 3%. Nominal wages in other contracts begin to reflect a future increase of 3%. As these wages and other resource prices rise by 3%, actual inflation begins to rise from about 0 to 3%. So inflation expectations translate into actual inflation rates because of our behavior that kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Higher inflation expectations shift the short-run Phillips curve upward. At any level of unemployment, inflation will be that much higher. Of course, that also works in reverse. Lower inflation expectations shift the short-run Phillips. During the 1960s, many economists believed that the trade-off represented by the Phillips curve represented a real choice in the economy. However, this view was greatly altered by later recognition that expected inflation affects the short-run Phillips curve. In the short run, expectations often diverge from reality. In the long run, however, any consistent rate of inflation will be reflected in expectations. Through much of the 1970s and early 1980s, the economy suffered from a combination of above-average unemployment rates coupled with inflation rates unprecedented in modern American history. This came to be known as stagflation, for stagnation combined with high inflation. In the late 1990s, by contrast, the economy was experiencing a blissful combination of low unemployment and low inflation. If inflation is consistently high, as it was in the 1970s, people will come to expect more of it. If inflation is consistently low, as it has been in recent years, that too will become part of expectations. So what does the trade-off between inflation and unemployment look like in the long run when actual inflation is incorporated into expectations? Most macroeconomists believe that there is, in fact, no long-run trade-off. That is, it is not possible to achieve lower unemployment in the long run by accepting higher inflation. This presents us with the idea of the long-run Phillips curve. Notice that the long-run Phillips curve is a vertical line. Notice here it is drawn at the unemployment rate of 5%. You may remember that 5% is an estimate of the natural rate of unemployment. This unemployment rate is also called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U. Yes, that is a long acronym. But just remember, it's the unemployment rate that's naturally occurring in the economy where in the long run you are not going to have accelerating inflation. So NARU is that acronym for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. You probably will see it as natural rate of unemployment, so it's not essential for you to memorize this acronym. And the long-run Phillips curve at the 5% or natural rate of unemployment rate. The natural rate hypothesis says there is a natural rate of unemployment in the economy, and it is the level of employment the economy needs in order to avoid accelerating inflation. It's also the point at which, remember, there is no cyclical unemployment, and so we say that the two are the same thing, right? Also, remember, the natural rate of unemployment is represented on the aggregate supply aggregate demand model by the long-run aggregate supply curve. It turns out that economists estimate the natural rate of unemployment by looking for evidence about NARU from the behavior of the inflation rate and the unemployment rate over the course of the business cycle. For example, the way major European countries learned, to their dismay, that their natural rates of unemployment were 9% or more was through the unpleasant experience of accelerated inflation anytime unemployment levels approached 8%. Some question if the NARU for the U.S. has risen in more recent years due to increased outsourcing of jobs that occurred in the last recession. This will be something to watch over the next several years. We'll know that as our unemployment rate gets down to 6% again, if that is accompanied by accelerating inflation, then our natural rate of unemployment may have risen as well. An effort to reduce unemployment below NARU will cause inflation. What about an effort to reduce inflation? It turns out that this is even more painful. The government must create a situation with contractionary fiscal or monetary policy where the unemployment rate is above NARU. This induced recession should decrease inflation rates to the point where the short-run Phillips curve shifts downward. But it can be very expensive. The U.S. retreat from high inflation at the beginning of the 1980s appears to have cost the equivalent of about 18% of a year's real GDP. Some economists argue that the cost of disinflation can be reduced if policymakers explicitly state their determination to reduce inflation. A clearly announced policy of disinflation, they argue, can reduce expectations of future inflation and so shift the Phillips curve downward. And just to reiterate, disinflation just means going from, say, a 5% rate of inflation to a 2% rate of inflation. We still may have inflation occurring, but it's going to be at a slower rate. We're slowing it down. We're putting on the brakes. It is different, though, from deflation, which is actually a negative inflation rate. And we can see what that movement downward looks like. So inflation means rising prices, disinflation means slowing inflation, deflation means falling prices. Lower prices sound great, so why is deflation a problem? And why is it hard to end? First, we have to consider debt deflation. Deflation, like inflation, produces both winners and losers, but in the opposite direction. Due to the falling price level, a dollar in the future has a higher real value instead of a lower real value. So lenders gain, but borrowers lose because the real burden of their debt rises. And since we always anticipate inflation, we plan on our debts having a lower real value. So this throws a double whammy at borrowers. What do you expect borrowers to do? Well, they cut back on spending. So weak spending causes deflation, which causes less spending, which causes deflation, and so on, and so on. We also have to consider the effects of expected deflation. We have already seen that interest rates are affected by inflation expectations. Like expected inflation, expected deflation affects the nominal interest rate. We have already seen nominal interest rate remember, equals real rate plus expected inflation. Suppose that the real rate of inflation is 2% and expected inflation is 3%. The nominal rate will be 5%. But what if there is prolonged deflation and the expected inflation, because it's deflation, is negative 2% and the nominal rate is 0%? Interest rates cannot fall below 0%. There is a zero bound. We don't have negative interest rates. We can have negative inflation rates, but not negative interest rates. Why? We aren't going to get paid to borrow money with negative interest rates. So deflation creates a situation where lenders receive nominal interest rates that approach zero. Lenders with no incentive to lend stop lending. If the economy is extremely depressed, which caused the deflation in the first place, monetary policy becomes completely ineffective. The Fed can't lower the interest rate lower than 0%. This kind of deflation can cause an economy to languish for a very long time. This is referred to as the liquidity trap. A liquidity trap is a situation in which conventional monetary policy is ineffective because nominal interest rates are up against that zero bound. A liquidity trap can occur whenever there is a sharp reduction in the demand for loanable funds. This is a revisit of the Fisher effect from Module 29, and it illustrates this point. Remember that D0 and S0 are the demand and supply curves for loanable funds when the expected future inflation rate is 0. At an expected future inflation rate of 0, the equilibrium nominal interest rate is 4%. An increase in the expected future inflation rate pushes both demand and supply curves upward by 1 percentage point for every expected change. D10 and S10 are the demand and supply curves for loanable funds when the expected future inflation rate is 10%. The 10 percentage point increase in the expected future inflation raises the equilibrium nominal interest rate to 14%. The expected real interest rate remains at 4%, and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds also remains unchanged. So how would this play out in reverse? Let's imagine we start back at S0 and D0. The equilibrium interest rate is 4%. If the expected inflation rate were negative 3%, the equilibrium nominal rate would be 1%. So both curves would shift downward to that 1% mark. But what if the expected inflation rate were negative 5%? Would the nominal interest rate fall to negative 1%? No, because again, nobody would lend with the expectation of a negative rate of return. They're better off just holding the cash. This figure shows U.S. short-term interest rates since 1920. As shown by the shaded area at the left, for most of the 1930s, interest rates were very close to zero, leaving little room for expansionary monetary policy. After World War II, persistent inflation generally kept rates well above zero. However, in late 2008, in the wake of the housing bubble bursting and the financial crisis, the interest on 3-month Treasury bills was again virtually zero. Japan has also experienced a liquidity trap in recent years. A prolonged economic slump in Japan led to deflation from the late 1990s on. The Bank of Japan responded by cutting interest rates, but eventually ran up against the zero bound and could do nothing else to lower interest rates further.